Good morning. Our report today is in part a personal story, but the implications extend far beyond me. It's a cautionary tale and relates to an issue that has become epidemic in our country. It concerns the danger of drugs, not recreational drugs, but prescription drugs. Drugs that are legally prescribed and used as directed, but the results are not always what we hope they will be. It starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, let me start with the personal part of this story. I experienced some health issues this year that involved some unsettling uncertainties waiting for a diagnosis, a number of test procedures, and some treatments that produced difficult side effects. While going through this process, which extended over many weeks, I turned to an anti-anxiety drug to help me through some of the difficult times. The drug was legally prescribed. The amount I used was well below normal usage. While it started out as something I would use on an occasional basis, it eventually became a daily use. And even though the amount was very small, far less than a normal dosage, I ultimately realized I had become dependent on this drug. A review of some very credible sites on the internet revealed, to my surprise, that this medication, which I had always thought of as kind of a friendly, non-threatening drug, was in fact highly addictive, and that withdrawal was not something anyone should attempt on their own. In my mind, I already knew that to be true. It was at that point I turned to our guest this morning, Dr. John Layman. He has been in Marquette for many years. His practice has varied, but much of what he does today is related to dealing with addiction. As we talk with Dr. Layman, I want to emphasize my purpose is not to focus on me and the situation I was able to deal with, but to use what I've learned through this experience to ask the questions that I hope will help all of us understand the dangers we're seeing today from some prescription drugs that can serve a very beneficial purpose, but also have a dark side. Much of the news today is focused on the opioid crisis, which is critically important and something we want to talk about this morning. But first, opioids aren't the only drugs that can produce unintended consequences. Dr. Layman, welcome back to the Ryan Report.
Good to be here, Don.
Good to have you with us. As I said, I'm not here to focus on me and my experience, although I thank you for helping me through that very much. And we're not going to talk about the drug specifically for a lot of different reasons, but it falls into a category of benzodiazepines, is that correct?
Yep, benzodiazepines.
What is that category of drug?
Well, it was originally developed as a anti-anxiety medication, and there are a number of benzodiazepines that are out there. People will probably be familiar with Valium, Librium, Klonopin, Xanax, and a lot of the sleeping medications actually are benzodiazepines, and so it gets both used for anxiety and for sleep.
Okay, and how does it work?
Well, it works on one of the neurotransmitters in the brain called gabapentin. Gabapentin is kind of our mood stabilizing anti-anxiety normal neurotransmitter we have in the brain, and it's an add-on to that particular neurotransmitter, and so it helps decrease anxiety when somebody takes a anti-anxiety medication like a benzodiazepine.
This is going to be a layman's really oversimplification kind of statement, but our moods are obviously a reflection on what we experience in daily life, but there are chemicals in our brains which really kind of drive how we feel, aren't there?
There sure are, and everybody's a little different in that regard. A lot of it is genetic, and you know, depending on what kind of experience you've had in life, it really many times can determine how we deal with things, how our brains deal with things, and especially if we started to use substances to try to get some of those things under control.
Now these drugs, again, which are very common and very widely used, they are beneficial when used properly.
They are exceedingly beneficial, and the issue with it really ends up being is for some people they can use it a few times, not have any issue with it, and some people can use it for a few times and start to have an issue right away. It really depends on what impact it has on the brain, and once your brain becomes used to it, it starts to depend on it. When you don't have it anymore, then you start to have some problems. Then you start to have, you can have withdrawal, you can have other issues that start to develop. So it's really, it is an effective medication, and people often ask me about benzos, and I tell them short-term use probably not going to be an issue. It's really The issue ends up being when you start to take it for a long-term period of time is really where we start to see the issue.
Are there other alternatives to the benzos, as you refer to them?
Yeah, there sure are. And I see a lot of patients who come in who have been on anti-anxiety medication like benzos, and so we start to work on finding alternatives to deal with whatever their situation might end up being. So there are medications, and they are effective, and they don't create the same kind of problem that a benzodiazepine would.
And there are solutions for people who have experienced this.
Absolutely. And the issue really ends up being, in many instances, the length of time somebody's been on one of these medications, first getting them off of it, and then finding a regimen that'll work. And I always tell them, you're typically on a marathon to try to get the brain to restabilize itself and to start to reproduce the normal neurotransmitters that have been downgraded or downplayed because of the benzo use. The neurotransmitter gabapentin, when you're using a benzodiazepine, doesn't produce as much of that gabapentin because it doesn't need it anymore. It's depending now on the drug that, the medication that they've been taking. And when you take that drug away, the amount of gabapentin in the brain is not there. And so you have a lot of withdrawal, you have an increased anxiety, you don't sleep very well. And so it creates a lot of issues, and those are the things that we work on trying to get under control.
And this withdrawal period can take some time, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's there's the acute what they go through immediately, but it can last months on end, and they can have recurrent symptoms for prolonged periods of time, months, and it's a struggle for people when they're going through this to actually find things that are going to help them. But again, we are able to help a lot of people get through that.
One thing I've learned is that it's not just people looking for a high who are taking these drugs. They're just having trouble dealing with the signals their brain is sending them when they don't take the drug.
Absolutely, and it could be situational things that they're involved in, places they're going, things that they're having done to them can create some anxiety, and so they'll use medication that's, as you said, appropriately prescribed. But again, the changes in the brain chemistry then cause some problems down the road.
Okay. I'll be back to talk about opioids in just a minute. Back with more on the Ryan Report just 2 minutes from now. Well, we hear very much about it. Dr. Layman, the opioid crisis. First of all, tell us, what are opioids?
Well, they're basically painkillers. People are familiar with Tylenol, which can be a painkiller, but it's not an opioid. Codeine, morphine, a lot of the semi-synthetic like Norco, Vicodin, and then you have the illicit ones like fentanyl. Well, fentanyl is actually prescription medication, but and then you have heroin.
Okay.
So those are typically a list of some of the opioid type medications that cause opiate effects.
How do prescription opioids work? Is it similar to what we talked about a moment ago?
It hits different areas of the brain. It really hits the reward area of the brain. You use an opioid, it gives you a good feeling. It gives you euphoria, makes you feel better. Those are kind of, and it really is hitting the neurotransmitter called dopamine. That's the one neurotransmitter that is actively involved with opioid issues.
And when we talk about people having a crisis, these aren't people who are drug addicts who start out with recreational drugs. Often they're taking a prescription.
Exactly, for legitimate reasons. They break their leg and they have pain and they get put on a pain medication, and unfortunately many, especially if they're in their teenage years when they're really susceptible, that increases their chance they could potentially develop a problem down the road. Another area is wisdom teeth removal. When does that happen? That happens when they're teenagers, and that's a risk time for kids that get that done, and especially if they get put on a pain medication and an opioid, they could potentially develop a problem. So,
well, for the average person, the average adult, how does it get out of control? What happens typically?
Well, again, the brain compensates for whatever you're using, and when you don't have the opiate there to create that good feeling, the dopamine level goes down, you don't have it there, you start to have withdrawal, you don't feel good, more depression, so you have all kinds of symptoms and basically withdrawal off of it. So, you know, the brain depends on, if you will, the medication that, or the drug that you've been using.
We see there are so many deaths from opioids. What's happening there?
Well, again, some of the more potent ones, the fentanyl, the carfentanil, they're getting mixed with heroin, depending on what the tolerance level is, which is how much of that particular drug do you have to take in order to have an effect of use. And when you use a more potent drug, then you're at risk for unintended sudden death.
Are there alternatives to opioids that doctors could use?
There are, and chronic pain management is something I do a lot of because people are on opioids, and so we have to get them off it, and we have to work on finding regimens of medications that we can use for chronic pain, which we can, and we have. There are a number of them that are out there that are good solutions to that kind of a problem versus continue to keep people on opioids.
What is the likely outcome? What do you think might happen here now that we have the attention of healthcare and government agencies and the public, that something has to be done about this?
Well, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, when we look at the amount of sudden deaths that happen in this country, 100, who knows how many hundreds a day are still dying. People are saying, well, it's kind of plateauing out. In certain areas of the country, I'm sure that's true. But it's still, there's so many people that have an addiction to the opioids and really don't have access to resources in order to get the help that they end up needing. Now, whether you see an addictionologist like myself, go to residential treatment, and there are a number of programs, substance abuse counselors, there's options out there. People need to access that when they have developed this problem, because without it, they're not going to have a whole lot of chance that they're going to be able to do it on their own.
And how does that process start?
Well, a lot of it is insurance dependent. As far as what they'll cover for various kinds of treatment. And so that would be the first part. Their willingness and wanting to do something about it. Admitting they got a problem, they want to get in, they want to start seeing what they can end up doing about the problem, really ends up being the key thing. A lot of times people aren't really motivated. They haven't had too many adverse effects happen. They like the way the drugs are making them feel. And so it becomes a real challenge to get these people to get the help that they want, you know.
Will their family doctor likely put them in the right direction?
We would hope so. I think there's a lot more awareness now from everybody who's practicing medicine about some of the dangers of the prescribing of opioids, as an example, and looking for alternatives to manage and take care of that, and then pointing these people, identifying that they have a problem, and then pointing them in the right direction to get the help that they end up needing.
Okay. A lot more issues to talk about. We'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. Back on the Ryan Report just 2 minutes from now. Our guest this morning is Dr. John Layman. We're talking about drugs and addiction. A couple of quick questions. You know, with these drugs, why can't we just keep taking them if they make us feel good?
Well, that's a commonly asked question of me. Why won't you prescribe what I've been taking? Well, because of all the problems they've had that are associated either with taking it or continuing to be able to get it, the addiction part of it that starts to happen, potential legal problems they end up having, jobs that they end up losing, whole myriad of different issues start to happen to people who use these substances. So it doesn't continue to provide what they initially had it provide for them. So that's the reason we can't continue to keep prescribing it.
And I assume probably the need increases maybe for some of them at least?
Well, definitely what we call tolerance, which means the amount today doesn't work tomorrow. So you need to get more of that drug or another one, and pretty soon you start to chase that, and you're always drug seeking, if you will, and that's certainly one of the components of somebody who has an addiction issue.
So the answer is to get off of it.
From my perspective, yes.
Another question that I have a personal interest in is, as we get older, does maybe our tolerance or our potential for addiction change? Aging
is certainly I don't know if I'd say a risk factor, but can potentially complicate any prescription medication that somebody might be on, as far as the effect it ends up having and the adverse effects that it potentially can end up having. Sure.
Okay. A couple of other issues. The state of Michigan the voters in Michigan just approved marijuana, recreational marijuana. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not in favor of it. I see so many patients that already use marijuana, and for many teenagers that start with alcohol and marijuana, it ends up being a gateway drug to bigger and better things, and then they end up coming to see me. So I'm not a real proponent of it. Now, people often say, well, it helps certain people, and certainly and I don't disagree with that. There probably are situations where it's optimum, but I don't see those patients. Those aren't the patients I end up seeing. The ones I see have addiction issues, and many times marijuana is a contributing factor to it.
And marijuana, do we know if it has negative effects on the body?
Oh yes, it definitely does, as far as what it does cognitively, as far as how the brain ends up functioning. And I think that's probably one of the key things. Now, people in many ways like the way it makes them feel, mellows them out, that type of thing, but it has an impact on brain function.
You've dealt a lot with this whole subject of addiction. You know, how would you define addiction in general?
Well, people compulsively use. They're unable to stop their use. They continue to use despite adverse consequences. They're going to have withdrawal off of it. So those are some of the things that most people, that when we define an addiction disorder, have as a result of their using.
And we can have both and or chemical or psychological addictions?
Sure. The physical part of it is certainly what people are most familiar with, especially when they're going through withdrawal. But the emotional parts of it are certainly pretty significant as well. Yeah.
A lot of people have problems with alcohol. What are there potentials to help them?
Well, again, just like any other drug, it has a profound effect on the brain. What it ends up doing initially on it, glass of wine may make you feel mellow, might make you feel pretty good. The longer you use, the more you use, the more the brain becomes to depend on it. People certainly develop an addiction to alcohol, and alcohol always has been in the UP an issue. A lot of the patients I see now have benzos and opioids as their primary drug, but alcohol hasn't gone away. I mean, we still have a large segment of our population that has alcohol issues.
I know there are obviously programs like Alcoholics Anonymous and others that help, but are there medications that can help in that withdrawal process too?
Well, absolutely. We detox people off alcohol or any other drug for that matter, and we do have approved medications that get utilized for chronic management of alcohol addiction.
We haven't had much time to talk about it, but obviously recreational drugs are an issue too. What do you see in this area as a main concern?
Well, the biggest one for the last 6 to 9 months has been meth. It has absolutely been unbelievable, the number of people that I end up seeing that meth hasn't been their drug of choice, but it's kind of been an add-on. So it's really prevalent in our community, and the adverse effects it causes are just unbelievable. It's a challenging drug for us to deal with because there are no approved medications for dealing with it, and so there's a lot of work being done now trying to find ways to deal with people who have chronic meth addiction.
And with these drugs, people can become hooked after just taking it once or twice sometimes. Right?
Well, the concept of instant addiction, absolutely there. I've had so many people, when I asked them the first time you used, what it did for them, and instantly addicted one time use it. Meth is one of those that can certainly be in that category. Cocaine is not far behind, but meth is certainly an instantly addictable drug.
Critically important subject. Thanks for coming in this morning to talk to us about it.
My
Always
pleasure.
a pleasure to talk to you. I'll be back with some other thoughts for you in just a minute. Well, during our conversation this morning, we talked about what has been described as a crisis in American life caused by the use of prescription drugs. But we should not indict all prescription drugs with that same label. We should not forget that drugs are a vital part of modern medicine. They're saving lives every day and improving the quality of life for people with chronic health problems. Drugs have opened up whole new avenues of treatment for health issues that once were considered to be untreatable. The use of drugs in healthcare dates back thousands of years, but most of the important drug discoveries have been in the last couple hundred years, many in the last century, and many of those in just recent decades and years. There are, in fact, new medicines brought to market every year. The availability of drugs has made us a pill-popping culture. We tend to believe all our ills can be cured by a pill, from an aspirin for aches and pains to the drugs that lower our blood pressure. While we hear a great deal today about the problems with opioids, the use or overuse of antibiotics has produced another serious challenge. Antibiotics are one of the most commonly prescribed drugs in the United States and have been cited as a major cause of the development of drug-resistant bacteria. And what about the opioids? According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, every day more than 115 people in the United States die after overdosing on opioids. The misuse of and addiction to opioids, including prescription pain relievers, heroin, and synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, is a serious national crisis that affects public health as well as social and economic welfare. Each week I try to end this show on a happy note, and there is one, and that's this. While the crisis in prescription drugs is very real, it clearly has the attention of healthcare providers, government agencies, and the American public. That doesn't mean that solutions will come easy, but there is a better chance that will happen when everyone knows what the challenge is. I said at the beginning, this story became somewhat personal for me. If it's a concern for you, talk to your family doctor or get professional help. There are answers if you seek them out. I'll be back in a minute. Well, that's our report for today. I want to remind you that it will be available on our website, uppermichigansource.com, starting tomorrow afternoon. The issues surrounding prescription drugs are very challenging. Thanks to Dr. John Layman for joining us to talk about this important issue, and thank you for being here. Please join us again next Sunday morning.